Okay, hi everyone watching. This is Errol Fox, PhD researcher at Newcastle University, looking at how designers participate in what they do as far as humanitarian and human rights open source software. So, what is design within humanitarian and human rights open source software? How does design get done? Do designers get involved in humanitarian open source software? Maybe also what are the differences between designers being involved in open source software and software that is and can be described as humanitarian or human rights related software. So one of the things that I really wanted to do for my PhD is writing about papers that I've read tends to be a little difficult for me. As well as reading papers. Reading papers is quite difficult as well. But maybe recording a video after I've read a paper, uploading them, and kind of having a conversation with myself about some of the things that I noticed, I think is a interesting, better way to approach how I understand papers. So what I've got here is a couple of papers that I've read really recently over the last couple of days. I've got a really like a backlog of different papers that I want to do this with. So this is going to be the first one. So this paper is a paper that got recommended to me by my supervisors at my university. One of the things that I don't feel I have as much background academic knowledge about is design, essentially. Like what are the academic writings about design historically, HCI, action research, participatory design, and all that kind of stuff. I feel like I've got a reasonably good backlog of reading done about open source software and even design, kinds of design within open source software. So not these kinds of designs specifically. So action research, participatory design, and HCI, although a little bit more HCI in open source. And I've got a bit of reading to done around open source and humanitarian and human rights technology, and also how design is in humanitarian and human rights organizations. But the background reading that I have about design and its history is lacking at the moment. So this was a paper recommended for me to read to build that knowledge base. So this is The Relationship of Action Research to Human-Computer Interaction by GILLIAN R. Hayes from the University of California, Irvine. So when I was reading this paper, I was reading it with the lens of being a designer within open source. And essentially what I was really looking for as I was reading this paper was not only absorbing and understanding the background of what action research is and its comparisons to human-computer interaction. And later in the paper, I believe that there is reference to participatory design and the differences or similarities there, and just kind of noting describing what these different ways of doing design are. But I was reading this from the point of view of what is interesting to me as a person researching designers within open source software that is humanitarian and human rights focused. So what can I pull out of here that is interesting considering that background? So what I've done is I've highlighted a few sections that I think are interesting, and I've made notes throughout the paper, which you can see in blue. The highlights are here in sort of like a pinkish color, and the notes are in sort of like a blue digital pen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the sections that I've highlighted and talk about them, and also possibly the notes that I have as well. So some of them will be notes on my bringing my understanding in, and some of them will just be questions that were raised by me. So here, the first section highlighted is approaches for conducting democratic and collaborative research with community partners. And this is a theme throughout action research as I'm learning. So the action research and to some extent participatory design, although there do appear to be differences between those two design-related engagements, interventions, however they're described. But there is this emphasis on democratic and collaborative as a way of interacting, and with community, or community partners, they're often referred to. And I think the reason that I started to highlight these sections is because of some of the principles within open source that are similar. So again, I'm not going to be self-describing as an open source principles expert. I am relatively new to the world of open source, like 4 or 5 years being doing design in various open source spaces. But these are the things which I've noticed from that kind of background and through that I'll be investigating deeper in this research. So open source, to some extent, although you could argue that it's not, there is a want or a desire for it to be a democratic kind of process or can be a democratic kind of process, depends on what kind of licensing you use and what kind of community makeup you end up having within the open source project. But that there is so democratic is kind of still a question mark, really open source wise. But collaborative is very often an aspect of open source software, and how open source software gets made and built is collaborative in and of itself, because unless you've got an open source software project where it's just a single person continually contributing and reviewing their own PRs and reviewing their own work, that's only really the case where I could say it's non-collaborative. But like the idea or the ethos of open source and the idea of making it open is so that it could be collaborated on and iterated on, forked, changed, remixed, all these kinds of things that we expect of putting something out in the open under a license which allows you to do those things. And this sense of community and community partners, this one becomes much more sort of relevant or thought of when you do understand open source as a community project or as a collaboration between community members. So this is why I've highlighted these sections. There was this section which was about how human-computer interaction community has shown a significant interest in doing research that has inherent value to society. And this kind of made me think of what open source thinks of itself and whether open source software thinks of itself as inherently valuable to society. And just the fact that I'm doing research within this space. And you could argue, especially within the section that I'm investigating, which is human rights and humanitarian open source software, there is an argument to be made from the increased inherent value to society of open source software, especially when you look at it in terms of humanitarian and human rights related open source software. And this, I think this section here, what the paper writer is talking about is action research has increased because it has, in its methods and practices and the kinds of communities that are engaged with through action research, there is an opportunity to do more research that has inherent value to society. So I'm interested in that connection between action research and how action research is done and where it's practiced, and like that question of whether open source software considers itself inherently valuable to society. Big question, but interesting. There was also this sentence about these kinds of projects, as in action research, these kinds of projects help bring women and other underrepresented groups into computing. I found this interesting as a statement, given that the idea of action research is to be inclusive of the entire community of which you're doing a project that is done in an action research type way that benefits the whole community. So the idea that you wouldn't include members of the community that are women and other underrepresented groups seems like an antithesis to action research. But it also kind of made me think with that open source software lens, in that there is a growing movement in open source software that is dedicated to bringing in women and other underrepresented groups into open source software and therefore computing. So it's an interesting kind comparison, or it's an interesting statement to be thought of in terms of what's happening in open source software at the moment. And again, especially within the lens of human rights open source software and humanitarian open source software, the principles of humanitarianism and human rights generally outside of the software side of things is about making sure that the people that are most harmed by not having their rights, respected or having under humanitarian crisis are often the underrepresented groups within those locations. And it just makes me think of like this increased need for methods within open source software, especially if it has humanitarian and human rights related links, to be as inclusive of women and underrepresented groups as possible, because it meets the principles of humanitarian and human rights, and also open source software just as a openness movement. So the idea being that anybody could participate in a project if they can locate it and find it and participate. The idea is that is a good entryway for a lot of underrepresented groups into the space. And it is, by virtue of being open, more inclusive. That's a big question about whether it is or not, but still, I think that's often the ethos. And I think one of the interesting connections to design here and potentially action research is that the idea of doing design is so that you can include as many heard and unheard voices within the design of a piece of software. And that extends, I believe, to open source software, and could be facilitated best through an action research approach within open source software to make sure that underrepresented users of the open source software or underrepresented people within the open source software are well listened to. So this is an interesting statement when you think about it in that way. I promise you this won't be every single line going through, but mostly just key things that I've noticed. So here we've got a statement which is a statement about participatory design conferences growing from small events focused on opening up conversations between design communities to an international conference, complete with research papers, poster sessions, and so on and so on. I find it interesting, mostly from this statement, the use of the term opening up and open, which is why I've noted over on the right-hand side the word open. So I find it interesting when there are cases within the design community and within design related academia and research that use terminology that are and have been used in the open source space, like opening up conversations about design. And often a lot of criticism about design within open source is the infancy, let's say, of design being open and opening up how design is done in order to meet the openness of, say, open source software, which is often a tension. So I'm interested to potentially dig in more to what does openness mean within action research history, and what does it mean within participatory design history, and what is openness for designers, because it's really integral to my research question as a sort of background. So the next section that I highlighted here is, I think at the same time, there are enormous questions about how feasible solutions are when developed without intense and sometimes very messy engagements with the people and problems that lie at the heart of these projects. And I think that when I read that, I also made this note of open source software is messy too. And that design or action research or participatory design, and often when I say the word design, generally I mean all these kinds of modes and methods of design, because there isn't really one particular way of doing design within open source software that has been well documented or well researched to be a stress tested way of doing good design within open source software. I think we're still discovering that in practice. But I think doing design within open source software is messy too, and that it is at the moment going through, or could be some projects that are trying to embed design within them, either in a sort of funded staff related way or in a contributions volunteer kind of way, is very intense and very messy, and relies on the engagement between the people and problems that lie at the heart of the open source software project. So I find just a really interesting, again, connection to how we do design within open source software here around a statement of why action research is important through the ways in which it engages with these intense, messy kinds of problems and projects. So next we've got comparative research on the conditions and effect of various forms of social action and research leading to social action. Oh, so this is a lot of descriptions of how action research models are used, so with a later diagram in the paper. It talks a lot about how action research is not necessarily a method, but instead a series of commitments to observe and problematize through practice a series of principles for conducting social inquiry. And I think I highlighted that because often I found that in practice, doing design within open source in a humanitarian and human rights space is that it is as much doing active design outputs as it is a commitment to observe the nature of how open source software gets built as a designer and input into that, and to work with these problematized spaces and principles through practice. And often by doing design in open source, regardless of human rights or humanitarian context, it is a kind of social inquiry. So I started to think about whether all design within open source software spaces is some kind of social inquiry, action research related intervention in and of itself, which could be interesting. I think I then went on to read how action research is explicitly democratic, collaborative, and interdisciplinary. The focus when conducting action research is to create research efforts with people experiencing real problems in their everyday lives, not for, about, or focused on them. Thus, action research focuses on highly contextualized, localized solutions with greater emphasis on transferability than generalizability. There's a couple of different things in here that I started to really realize a little bit lower down in the paper, further on in the written piece. And I wrote what here because it's interesting when you look at the AR is to create research efforts with people, not for, about, or focused on them. And this really draws on attention in open source, in that the people that build open source aren't always the people that use the open source, and the people that use the open source aren't always the people that build the open source. And then often it becomes a case of how do we as designers do good design on the real problems that isn't for, about, or focused on people and is more with people, and how do we include not only the people that build the open source software but also use the open source software that don't feel like they are part of the build of it. And I think this is a tension that action research doesn't necessarily pose a solution to, but it certainly draws a distinction between doing things with and for and about and focused on. And I think that this could be a key aspect to trying to find a way of doing design within open source with different stakeholders that could just help kind of that become more understandable. Because I think drawing on my own personal experiences of doing design in open source, often it's quite hard for a myriad of different reasons to design with the people that use and don't build. It's also sometimes quite hard to design with the people that build and don't use due to different kinds of factors. But I think that if action research were to be used in an open source, in a design in open source software kind of context, there would need to be a deeper understanding of what with means and what for, about, and focused on also means within these contexts, and how to break those or how to merge those together. I also got interested in this. Action research focuses on highly contextualized, localized solutions with greater emphasis on transferability than generalizability, because at first I understood that as within the terms of open source, that every open source project must be locally relevant and therefore can't be inclusive of these open source projects which are sort of globally or generalizedly useful. And I started to think, okay, would action research really only consider open source projects that are very local, very specific to either a location or a specific need or purpose, like there's two different ways of looking, like understanding the word localized. Would those only be relevant to action research, or would those only be able to have action research done within them instead of perhaps these bigger open source projects, which actually, don't necessarily have, that are global and therefore don't have a location outside of the digital open source repository location, or maybe the localized of a localized problem, if you understand localized as in terms of a localized problem as opposed to a geolocation. But then I started to think about the way that sometimes open source projects, when they become too broad and generalized, then become much more viable for forking and making more specific to a certain need. And then I started to think, okay, does localized in this circumstance mean that a project that is still able to be locally relevant as well as like globally relevant? I think there's a big question to be asked here about like, what does localized solutions mean within an open source context, and what does generalized mean within an open source context? The next section I've got highlighted here is opening. Pragmatism must focus on opening up new conversations and keeping them going, even through conflict, a position held by most action research approaches in which discussion, communication, and collaboration among all stakeholders are fundamental elements to the generation of knowledge and the production of change. And I often, I wrote the note here that this is often design's role within open source to open up new conversations. Not that new conversations don't open up without designers involved, but often designers introduce lots of kinds of new conversations by virtue of what they do. And then by virtue of new conversations being risen by designers, that conflict arises, and the discussion, communication, and collaboration is an integral part of trying to do design within open source, even if you're talking about a small graphical design change, or if you're talking about a big user experience design change across a whole entire open source software project. And I think it's just interesting that action research expects that of itself, and so do designers within open source often not necessarily expect that of themselves, but they introduce that by virtue of what they are and what they do within open source. The next bit I've got is about how action research differs in its approaches, ontological, epistemological, and methodological commitments. These underlying assumptions put the researcher and the partnerships with research participants at the center of the process of inquiry, shading all the ways in which data are collected, analyzed, and reported, and change is implemented. So I think that this is an interesting statement when you maybe look at how to do research around designers in open source rather than design within open source specifically. So what I will be looking at in my PhD research is the designers in partnership with their research participants or the open source software project community, and that they are their relationships and their processes of inquiry are what I am researching. So what is that relationship and what does that look like? And that is really like how action research is both done and observed within designers within open source software within these humanitarian contexts. And this was more a note to remind myself to really think through what that means and what I'm looking at within this research, more so than a comment on specifically design as action research within open source software. Okay, the next bit that I've got highlighted here, we've got knowledge evolves. The goal of an action research project is to understand a specific situation and develop localized solutions. So again, I started to think about the OSS starts as localized and becomes generalized or localized again. So this, I started to think about the cycle of like how maybe not all open source projects, but some open source projects start as a localized solution to a problem that either one or more developers often have. And then as it grows, if it grows, it becomes generalized, and then it becomes localized again if people fork it for a particular reason to then make it more locally relevant to them. So this is where I started to really puzzle out that cycle. The next bit, I've got AR's emphasis on democratic and collaborative inquiry leads to an orientation towards knowledge as co-constructed. So I started to look at the co-design words here, and co-constructed is an interesting word. All people affected by or having an effect on an issue should be involved not only in the process of divining solutions to the issue, but also in the process of research inquiry. Both practitioners, be they HCI, human-computer interaction professionals, or domain experts from whichever domain that they are part of, and research have valuable knowledge to contribute, and action research rests on the assertion that all participant contributions are taken seriously and treated with equal weight. And I wrote next to this is open source in theory, but is it open source in practice? And I think that this is a really interesting reflection of what action research is trying to do. And it's really was that moment where I said, well, open source tries to say that everybody that is affected by or can have an effect on an open source project has some kind of stake in this open source project, should be able to input into the process of defining solutions to that open source software and the issues, both tangible, actual issues created to solve problems, but also the issues generally of the open source project. But often this isn't what happens in practice because of various different kinds of engagement, probably would be my best guess. Like, so how you have to have a certain level of understanding of tools and the software and the ability to engage with the open source software to be able to have a place at that table to divine solutions. So I think here about how action research could bridge the gap between, and has bridged the gap between, in some of my personal design related projects in open source software and humanitarian human rights open source software, where action research methods and practices have bridged that gap between people that are absolutely useful and can affect solutions and should be involved in that process, but cannot due to the inaccessible, let's just say the inaccessible methods that open source software often uses from a technological point of view. But the action research does assert that, you know, there is equal weight to be had there. So somebody that can participate versus somebody that could participate if they had the means to is, you know, that they are of equal weight regardless of their in-depth knowledge, let's say, of like the open source software in its workings. I then started to, in this paragraph, circle a number of different words that are very, you know, not that, you know, any particular domain owns a particular word, but I just found it really interesting that there are a lot of words here that are used within open source, like iterative, or software development generally, iterative, continually, cycles, and distance, mostly just from the globalized nature of how sometimes open source software gets made and how it's like not necessarily a physical proximity kind of thing. It's like a digital proximity kind of thing, and that distance is null and void in a lot of ways. There are, yeah, but anyway, it was an interesting series of words that I noticed and began to notice throughout this paper that are used in open source spaces. I've got highlighted here, encourage problem solving alongside their research subjects. So we're talking about the people that build open source here and the people that also use open source, because they're not always the same, but they can be. And that designers in open source do try to do this, but we are not researching the subject. So I think that when I was writing this statement, I was thinking about particularly like developers on a open source project. They're not necessarily our research subject as designers, although I couldn't also say that they're not. But we are solving alongside them in this kind of co-creative way. both organizational and technological change. These changes were meant to achieve the end goal of semi-autonomous groups who can solve problems independent of management when given the right resources. So this was a description of a action research project, and there's a few descriptions of action research projects which aren't necessarily software-based, although some of the examples do have a software or technological element to them. But I found this interesting, where like this describes essentially a sustainable open source software project, right? That the changes within a project or a project, an open source software project, is the idea is to construct it in a way, not always the case, but still, the idea is that it's open, therefore it can be semi-autonomous in its way, that people can contribute and improve it, or use it and then improve it, and however the project kind of lives on. And the action research in and of its kind of self is, the idea is to construct is maybe not the right word, but be able to leave the action research project knowing that the people that were part of who you designed with form this semi-autonomous group to keep things going. And I think that this is often the idea of how open source software becomes sustainable, and could be something to dig into about how design in open source software can be made part of a sustainable open source software project. And user-centered design stems from the solutions available to the systems designers and research at the time. They could re-educate systems designers or engage a participative approach to systems development, because end users, unlike systems experts, possess detailed knowledge of the organization and the work practices in question. When I read this, and I've written next to it, it made me think of like the maintainer of an open source software but in comparison to, or in conjunction with, end user. So I was thinking about the maintainer of an open source software project as the systems designer, and the end users, who are, unlike the systems experts, possess detailed knowledge of the organization and the work practices in question. And I think that this started to make me think more about the complementary ways in which the people that build the open source software and also possibly use it are distinct and different from the people that are the users of open source software, and that they have equal stake in how this should be improved, but how their involvement, the ways in which they are differently involved in a project, mean different things for the project. So in here we've got like a description that the systems designers are the systems expert, and they possess the detailed knowledge, or they possess knowledge, and you could re-educate systems designers towards a participatory or participative approach to include end users due to their like working knowledge of how the open source software is used, and kind of remove that systems design bias potentially. Anyway, I started to think about like the relationships between the different kinds of people that build open source software here. There's some diagrams here about how user-centered design and also action research is done. And I looked at the user-centered design cycle and kind of redrew it from an open source perspective, or more like a very generalized open source perspective. I know that this isn't going to apply to all open source, but often open source has like a dev and evaluation cycle, and doesn't really have like a design and an analysis cycle as much. And then I sort of drew like how often design and analysis tries to feed in at every point of this like cycle between development and evaluation. And that's sometimes how we try to do design within open source, because there's not often a dedicated section of the circle for design. And then I looked at the action research spiral, and I didn't really see a way to have design. Well, design is part of like every part of an action research spiral, I suppose. But it's also made me think of agile just generally. But it still was unclear to me what, like, how this could potentially translate to open source software. I guess like the build is the act, or the development is the act, and then you've got like a reflective planning stage that kind of keeps spiraling. But the more I looked at this, the more I wondered how, I mean, the tricky thing here is practice versus researching, but I would be interested to see if anyone's tried to implement this kind of approach within open source software projects, because my assumption based off of practice-based knowledge is that this is infeasible given just the various constraints of open source software, or would be incredibly difficult. Not that that's necessarily a reason to not do it, but still. Okay, so we've got AR calls for action by both the researchers and the community partners as an explicit part of the process of inquiry. Action is a means for developing knowledge. As GILLIAN famously noted, the best way to understand something is to try and change it. That kind of made me think about a lot of open source software processes, and that a lot of people learn how an open source software project functions by forking it and kind of trying to change it. It just kind of made me kind of laugh a little bit. But also the first part of that statement, which is just about the nature, I think, of how design can be done within open source software, which is like explicitly with the community partners and the process of inquiry as part of the increased knowledge, developing knowledge of an open source software project, is that relationship between designers and the community partners, or the open source software community. Like there is an impact there just on the way that things are done by virtue of doing it. AR emphasized understanding of the local context and the development of local solutions without an eye for privileging of generalizable results. This is really, I wrote here, not really large open source software, but I started to really wonder if there is, again, another tension between open source software in practice and then kind of how open source software would maybe ideally be built, which is often well, it's not just open source software, it's kind of all software in a lot of ways, but like how there is a bias towards like impact on the on the things that will make the most impact, and designing like more generally more quickly for more like benefit rather than like localized solutions. So I kind of, yeah, it kind of makes me think about like the specificness of action research within local solutions, and it makes me think about what that would look like within open source more than anything, more than really having any like concrete or clear answers or ideas around that. I'm interested, like, that within action research, a goal is transferability, like transferability to the community partners, I'm assuming. So I'm interested in what that means within the design practice. And then I read here sharing sufficient knowledge and transfer to other contexts, which just made me think of readmes and forking processes within open source. Okay, so we've got the researcher as a friendly outsider is an approach that explicitly rejects the idea that researchers should distance themselves from subjects of their research in the name of objectivity, and requires instead that they become coaches, skilled at opening up the lines of communication and facilitating research activities with community partners rather than designing and implementing research about them. I think this is really interesting, given that often a lot of the advice that is given to designers wanting to do design within open source is that you become part of the communities that the open source is about before you even try to do design at them. And I think that this sounds like that is the action research approach, is that you become a coach as much as you become a production or the ability to produce design. So I think that that's interesting when you look at how design is currently practiced, or can be currently practiced, in open source. What have we got here? Negotiation between all the actors in the project is pretty similar to open source software in principle. Not always all actors in the project get to have a part of the negotiation process, but still, within principle, often a lot of governing structures within open source does attempt to do that. What have we got here? Design of these socio-technical interventions must be conducted collaboratively with community partners. Again, this is just more comments on how action research describes a process of doing design within open source pretty neatly from my experiences. But then we've got something here about PD, so participatory design, and action research stem from the notion that change should be designed and implemented democratically and inclusively. However, the scope of participatory design is typically more limited to the design of solutions, whereas the scope of action research includes the notion of learning through action. And I think this is interesting when you look at this distinction between participatory design and action research, potentially, in that I would say that participatory design, which is limited to the design of solutions, is often what is asked of more of designers within open source. So, and valued more and understood better. So it's like, just to describe a scenario, a simple sort of conversational scenario, in that if you're a designer going into an open source software project, often you are asked to design the thing to the screens, the UI, the something visible and tangible that improves, like the solution to a problem. Here are the designs that solve that problem. Whereas the idea of action research is also that the value of learning how to participate in a design process is also valuable. And what is it? It helps change, essentially. So I think that this is something that, while a lot of designers are kind of doing and instinctively doing, which is they're learning through action by participation and doing design within open source, is often not understood as a value within open source, and that the design of the solutions is valued much more. The extensive co-construction of knowledge before, during, and after the implementation of any change, technological or otherwise. Broad scoping ensures that the problems as well as the solution are collaboratively developed and articulated. Yeah, this is interesting, depending on how you do design within open source, whether you are included within the problem construction collaboratively or not is kind of interesting, because I've seen this go many different ways within open source, like either design and therefore community partners are part of the problem creation process, or whether you are simply assigned a problem as a designer to go produce the solution for. The end goal of action research is not the best solution to a problem, but rather a greater understanding of the setting through engagement and in change and production of potentially better solutions, iteratively over long periods of engagement. I think that often, I think this is a complicated statement, because I often think that the expectation of design within open source is that this is not a long period of engagement, in that it's just about designing a solution, but often the way that you do end up doing design within open source is a much longer period of engagement, and not only providing better solutions to a problem through the community partnership approach of action research, but like that you build the understanding of the setting through engagement. And I think that that's often the way that design is done within open source, but often not the pitch of design within open source, if that makes sense. An attitude that focuses on the outcome of learning something, regardless of the success of the design or intervention, can free up the team to attempt interventions that may be risky or undetermined. That's probably quite a scary concept within open source software, just because of limitations of time, resources, etc. But the idea there is that action research could, regardless as to whether it provided some kind of solution or not, in that it if observed, it could help change the way that the project progresses by virtue of having learned something from the action research process. It looks like that was, I've got a couple of other things here, so haven't underlined this bit. This was about how action research is also important to do the writing. If you're doing academic research as part on the subject of action research within communities, doing some kind of project, in that the writing of the academic research should also be in should also be done in a participatory way with the community. So from my perspective, I wrote in the column in the margins here that would mean writing my academic insights with the open source software teams that eventually become my case studies or observation studies. And I kind of a little bit scared about the prospect of that just because of the time related aspect, so that we'll see. But the idea of action research within open source software would be to co-write, essentially. Okay, what else have we got here? The time for the collaborative part of the project may be ending. Oh, this is about leaving a project, essentially. Successful AR projects result in sustainable, dependable change, which can be less interesting from a research standpoint than the implementation of a new one. So this is about when academic action researchers, or not non-academic action researchers, leave a project. And this then further goes on to talk about like sustainable change, maintenance and maintaining, the new or changing of old policies, technologies that get left behind and maintained. That made me think about the fact that there are no action research tools that are also open source at the moment that I know of. So that made me think about, well, if you're going to leave a open source software community or an open source community, having done an action research type engagements with them, then how could you leave them with open source tools if there don't already exist any? Or is it, are there ways in which to use existing open source software tools in order to uphold action research? But it did make me think about that. But it also made me think generally a little bit more about action research and the continual maintenance and development of a project, and how that connects to open source and the ideas of open source. What have we got here? Not only must participants understand the research, they must be allowed to be in positions of greater power than those afforded the subjects of a controlled study or even the participants in a design project, which the designer has to make all the kinds of decisions and judgments, such as how to frame the situation, who to listen to, what to pay attention to, what to dismiss, and how to explore, extract, recognize, and choose useful information from all the potential sources. So this is about really emphasizing the equitableness of action research. So it's not that the designer becomes, or the researcher doing action research is in any kind of position of influence or authority, but that their presence facilitates a more equal share of this kind of the voice within a project. And my question was just really like, how would you begin to do that within open source software, especially when there are some hierarchical structures within open source software, sometimes by governance, and sometimes just by choice. I'd be interested to read more action research studies where participants in the community just didn't want to participate at a level as somebody else maybe in the community did, because they didn't want to, not necessarily because there wasn't the pathway facilitated for the equality, but that they get to still choose, whether that is influenced by equality or non-equality or comfort, discomfort. It's still kind of interesting. I think this is because I was sort of beginning to expect within an open source software setting, if I were to bring, for example, the founder of an open source software project that is still perhaps a maintainer, an active maintainer, and maybe several other active maintainers or contributors alongside contributors that have contributed maybe once or twice. It's how would that be facilitated? Could it be facilitated? Does it need to be facilitated? Because action research talks about facilitation as the designer, as how does that remain action research and ethical within the principles of action research? It's kind of a tricky subject. So I'd like to read more about that before I attempt it, or, ever attempt it, essentially. Most notably, the end product of action research is learning and scholarly knowledge, whereas the end product of a software design and development is typically a technological artifact. I wrote not in open source software always. So, okay, so I can't really, challenge AR as much. But sometimes the end product of software design and development, typically being, I think typically here is the key word, but is technological effort, and not always, because it might be, like is said earlier on in the paper, like a policy change or a knowledge base or an understanding of a practice. So it's just interesting. It's interesting that often we put things in boxes, right, to try and better understand them, to like software design development equals technological artifact, not always. And I do believe that's all my comments on this paper. So I'm going to be doing this for more papers. Some of them might be longer, some of them might be shorter, but thank you for listening if you did indeed listen.